All right, so we're going to be keeping track of the launch. The launch is supposed to happen T minus 2, or wait, it's 2 o'clock. 3, 4, 2 to 3, 3 to 4. 5 o'clock. For those of you who don't know, like the inspiration for mission to space, SpaceX, the Elon Musk-led venture, they sent some people up over the summer, astronauts, but this is the first civilian, so these people are not astronauts. They're not exactly what I would say regular people, but they are not astronauts. And one of the people going up is Cyan Proctor. Dr. Cyan Proctor teaches at South Mountain Community College. She's part of the Maricopa County Community College system. So that is awesome. It's her and 3 other people. It's a little about her.
Became a scientist because of my father. He was a self-trained mathematician and scientist, and so he never went to college or got a college degree, but he instilled this love of math and science in me and my siblings. So I am so thankful that my father really helped unleash the inner explorer in me. The main goal of the Inspiration 4 mission is to raise $200 million for St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. My role is to help inspire people to show generosity and to give support for ending childhood cancer. I can't imagine any place better than the Maricopa Community Colleges to work at. I have been a professor at South Mountain Community College for 21 years. One of the things that I always tell my students is education is power. It gives you options and opportunities, and it doesn't stop with your degree. Education, getting your degrees, getting certificates, it does make a difference. It's really about finding your unique strengths and your passions and then being able to share that with the world. So to all of the community college students out there, don't give up. Keep going, keep pursuing your dreams, and let me tell you, they will come true. You just gotta believe in it.
So she's a South Mountain Community College professor. T minus 3 hours, I guess.
So it's less than half a mile or so. They've also got their...
So they're using the new rocket. The new rocket is reusable, which is the big deal. Instead of it not being reusable, they can reuse parts of it after it's done. And this is, this is the 4th one, Inspiration 4. This is the 4th SpaceX launch. And yeah, they're using the NASA facility. They're at Cape Canaveral in Florida. So this is, whatever it is, 8 o'clock their time or so, about 3 hours from now. And yeah, I think in a little bit here, they're going to get taking the trip over to the launch pad. And they're going to be up there for, I think, 3 or 4 days or so before they come down. They're not going to go to the space station, but they're just going to be in the capsule in the thing. But yeah, a community college professor from Maricopa County Community Colleges, which is just awesome. You know, it's not someone from Yale, it's not someone from Stanford. It's, yeah, it's great. The other 3 people, one person has a lot more, sort of flight experience. There's a nurse from, she's in Nashville, or wherever St. Jude's is. I think it's Memphis. And then someone else from, I think he's from California. So all civilians. So we'll check in again later as it's going on. Cool. All right. Everybody got your notes ready? Spline Objects. Trying to do our super fast intro to all of these objects here. Let's see. Let's make sure this stream is going well. You guys can hear me on the stream? I think so. So this squiggle right here. This was done with the extrude spline object. And based on looking at it, what mode is the spline in? We talked about 2 different spline modes. Emily? Uniform, right? The 2 I would have in my notes are uniform and adaptive. There's some other ones here, but those are the ones I use most of the time. Right? Adaptive is going to give you more subdivisions around the curves. And uniform, like it says, will be uniformly placed throughout the topology. So I guess in most cases, adaptive would be less polygons, but there's a lot of instances where you want the polygons more evenly spaced for a variety of reasons. And so those would be the 2 I use most often. And then we had this object here. So bowls, plates, things with radial symmetry, all of those kind of objects are going to be made with this object. This is the lathe object. How many of you guys know what a lathe is? So a lathe is a tool used for making things that have radial symmetry. Let's see if we can just find one here.
Arizona homeowners, how would you like to get a
In a minute. There we go. So this is a lathe, right? A lot of times, mostly you see wood on a lathe. It spins really fast, and you're using tools to subtract from the surface to create, in wood instances, these are like drumsticks or table legs or baseball bats, those kind of things, right? Let's see where this ends up. Yeah, so there you see this one's totally smoothed out, and there's the other parts of it. And so it's a subtractive process in this instance, right? You're taking stuff away in order to create this. But in our in Cinema 4D, it's more of an additive thing. Let's look at that one more time. The thing with the lathe that I don't think I adequately got into here is 2 things. The thing is 2 things. So Casey should have said 2 things about the lathe. Number 1, you really want to make sure the first point on the spline is in the middle. Right? So most of the time this is going to be at 0, x. X equals 0. You'll see why in a minute. If that's not lined up, you're either going to end up with a hole in the bottom of your object, or you're going to end up with a bunch of extra junk in the bottom of your object, like extra polygons that don't need to be there. The second thing is that most of the time when you're using the lathe to make the kind of objects I talked about, right? Things that have radial symmetry, plates, bowls, any type of drinkware, usually, right? Like a wine glass. We'll make a wine glass here real quick. Is that you don't want to make objects that have no thickness, that are only 1 polygon thick. And so you want to draw the inner and outer walls of the shape. Allow me to demonstrate here. So we'll make a really simple bowl, but slightly less simple than before. So I'm going to go ahead and get the Spline Pen, which works like the Illustrator one. I'm going to make sure I go to my front orthographic view, because we always draw splines in orthographic views. I said that before, right? Yeah. Always draw, always type, always draw splines in orthographic view. And so if we're making a bowl here, I'm going to start here in the middle, as close to the middle as I can. And the Spline Pen is like Illustrator. So you can click and drag. When you drag, it pulls out the Bezier handle. And here we go. And here, here, and here. There we go. And I hit escape. And I drew the inner and the outer wall. So my object is going to have thickness. In general, this is the better practice. So now I'm going to go ahead and grab the... Actually, before I do that, so I drew the inner and outer wall. That's a big one. I'm going to go ahead and grab these points here on the spline. So with the spline selected, make sure I'm in point mode, and here and here. And so I clicked pretty close to the axis, but as you can see, it wasn't exactly on the axis. And so here and here, I'm going to put it on the spline first, and I'll show you what the issue is. And so I'm going to go ahead and make the lathe object, put the spline in there, and at first glance, looks okay. Looks like we have a lot more subdivisions around the edge. Why is that? And what mode is the spline in? Adaptive, right? Because the adaptive means more curvature around the edge. So it looks good, but let's inspect closer. And upon closer inspection, we have a hole in the middle here because there's distance between that very first spline point and 0, 0, 0, where it should be, or at least 0x rather. And if we look at the bottom side of it, we'll see the opposite problem, but still a problem, is that when you overshoot, you end up with something that looks like this. When you see this under any circumstance in the editor, like a bunch of polygons that are changing color, and you're like, oh, that doesn't look good. It doesn't look good because it's not. This means that you've probably got some kind of overlapping polygons happening here, and that's also something you want to really avoid. You don't want to have polygons that are in the same space as other polygons. So let's clean some of this up. And I'm going to come back in here to this view to do this and turn off the lathe object. And just line up these points. So here, this one, in order to make sure, essentially the lathe is spinning around this line. Okay, this green line, green is Y, but it's spinning around that. Okay, so it's spinning on the x-axis, but the green is the Y line. And so we need to move this over onto the line. Okay, if it's up or down, that's fine, but as long as it's right here, and so the x-coordinate should be 0. If we select that point in point mode and come in here and look at the bottom, okay, not in the coordinates, because the coordinates is this is the coordinates of the entire object, right? And so we need the coordinates of just this point. And so I'm going to come down here under position and just say 0. There we go. That moves that directly over there. I'm going to move it down so it's right about there. And let's check out the other one. Here, again, spacebar to select. And then, again, making my x 0. There we go. And so now if we were to turn everything back on, let's check it out.
Do you have to connect them?
No, they're not connected. So no, in fact, you do not. most of these kind of radial objects, you do not want them connected. Do not, right? Because if you look at them, they're not connected, right? The green line is just the axis line. There's no spline line between that. If you connected them, there would be, it would make a bunch of polygons inside that you don't want. All right, let's turn that back on. See what we got. And now, see how this looks much cleaner. And then on the other side, also, upon further inspection, much cleaner now. So 2 things you need to remember with the lathe object. Now the spline itself is going to control the geometry along the spline you drew. So for instance, if I change it to uniform, I get that. So now I have even subdivision across the surface, but not so much rounding on the edge. Okay? I'm not saying that's bad, it's just that would be, you might need to address the rounding in another way. If I go back to adaptive, there you go. And even when it's in an adaptive, like here clearly adaptive is doing a better job just for what I want here. But I got this, it seems like there's a lot of geometry right there. Let's inspect the spline. So if I come back to the spline, I might have double spline points here and not have realized it. Yeah. Okay, this is the other thing. I talked about this morning. I'm going to come in here and adjust this Bezier handle. I can't. This is a bug as far as I'm concerned. You must be in the Move tool in order to adjust Bezier handles in C4D, right? This is just bad interface design. It'll show you the Bezier handles if you have the select tool, but you can't click on them. You have to be in the Move tool to actually drag the handles on a spline. I am currently in the select tool right here, and that means I clicked on this point, but I can't grab the handle. I need to select the Move tool. What's the shortcut for the Move tool? E, exactly. And now I can sort of straighten this out a little bit. Same thing here. And if I want not quite as many subdivisions there along the edge, I can turn up my adaptive angle. And you see that that chills that out. And so by default it's at 5. A lot of times I find myself turning that up so that I don't have these really, really high concentrations of geometry in some places. Make sense? All right, so there's one lathe object. Let's make another one. So for instance, I'm going to turn that one off. Let's come in here to the front, do some sort of quick wine glass. Again, I'll use the Spline Pen. And so remember, you're drawing half of it. So I'm going to go out here. And in this case, I'm not going to click and drag. I am going to just click. And so this will keep it linear. So this is how I do a lot of drawing in, like if I do stuff in Illustrator. I'm sort of roughing out the shape and then in the first pass. And then I go back and figure out where I want there to be some curvature and then address it. And so for instance, kind of this this. So I'm just clicking. There we go. So I've got this now. And so now I can go back and adjust where I want. None of these points have Bezier handles right now. Because if you don't click and drag, it'll just make a linear interpolation between points. Which in this case isn't bad. I can sort of refine this a little bit. Say I want to thin out this section here and this along the top. Ugh, too much clicking. Had my thumb on the wrong thing. So I'm just sort of cleaning up some of these points, there and there. And let's do our housekeeping. This point needs to get to 0x. And then the end point, which is here, also needs to be at 0x. Let's put it in a lathe, see what we get. Another good one, I don't have this quite memorized. If I hold down is it? Yeah, okay. So if you hold down Alt when you make a new object, it'll make the new object a parent of the object currently selected. Saves you a step, right, from having to then make the child. So that's a good one. Let's make a note of that. So it is Alt plus make a plus, click on or make new object is new object is parent. Shift plus make new object object is child. There we go. And so this one here, so this was bowl, I'll just label that. This one is wine glass. Let's look at this. There we go. All right, so the points are good, but we want to introduce some curvature here. This is some more just general spline wrangling. Let's look at this. So I'll turn off the lathe for a second so I can see this spline. There's two different ways to, once I click to establish these points, there's two things I would do to establish curvature. Let's see here. When you just click and make a point, Cinema 4D calls that hard interpolation, or like a hard corner. And so the opposite of that is a soft point, or I think they say soft interpolation. Essentially, that'll give you the Bezier handles. The second thing to manage curvature is a separate tool to round. We've talked about rounding the corners of geometry, right? When we bevel them. For Cinema 4D, when you round the corners of a spline, that's called chamfer. Chamfer, a single point into a curve. Let's look at both of them here, because I guess these days, the Bezier handles, I don't know. Recently, I enjoyed chamfering the corners. Just seems a little bit cleaner. But those are the two possibilities here. Let's look at both. And so I'll click on this point and right click, and this is what I'm talking about. This is what I get by default if I just click, which is what I did when I made my wine glass spline. And this will give you the Bezier handles. And so I'll change this point to soft interpolation. Now I have handles. Remember, I got to be in the move tool to adjust them. Maybe that's why I stay away from this, is that whole move tool thing that always gets irritating. And so I can adjust that handle, right? So that's one way to curve it out after you rough out the points. The other way is chamfering. So if I come in here, and let's say both of these points I want to chamfer. And so I'm going to go ahead and select both those, right click, and say chamfer. So I'll grab that tool. And now, just like other tools, right? When you use a tool, you almost always don't click on the thing, which I guess is kind of counterintuitive, but that's the way it works. And so I'm going to click and drag. And you see it splits the point into 2 points and then does rounding in between. All right, so that's chamfering. C-H-A-M-F-E-R-I-N-G, those points. See how that's a little bit cleaner? I don't know. I just find it easier to use. And then I can go back. Another really great Cinema 4D shortcut. Spacebar. What does spacebar do? Switches between the 2 most recently used tools. This is super, once you get into this rhythm, it's great. Because most of the time when you're using a tool, you get into this pattern. Select the points, use the tool. That's usually the pattern of what you're doing. And so once you do that once, then they're both in your tool memory, and you can just use spacebar to go back and forth. Select, chamfer, select, chamfer, select, chamfer, select, chamfer. It's a really, and this, not just for chamfering, for anything, right? Whatever tool is. You can see your tool history right, is it this one? No, that's the, is it this one? It's this one, right here. And so this one shows you your recently used tools, right? And so selection, chamfer. So spacebar is going to go back and forth between those 2. And so here I'll go ahead and grab those 2, spacebar, chamfer. Come down here, spacebar, grab this point, spacebar, chamfer. Spacebar, grab this point, spacebar, chamfer. Right? And now, when I turn on the lathe, I have a little bit more of a sophisticated wine glass. Make sense? Let's make one more thing with the lathe. I'm going to go ahead and go back to the Spline Pen. Let's make a table leg, sort of a wood craftsman sort of table leg. So I'll come over here. There we go. Okay, that looks pretty good. Let's clean it up again. So make sure I grab this point right here in point mode. Put that at 0. Grab the one at the top, do the same thing. Put that at 0x. Let's put it in a lathe, see what we get. There we go. That's interesting. And now if we come back to spline mode, we can chamfer some points. So for this one right here, I want to round that. So right click, chamfer. What is the chamfer? There's no shortcut for chamfer apparently. There we go, that rounds that out a little bit. And then all of these points up here, this in and out, this is another good trick. I think we did this on Monday maybe. I've got all these points here that I use for like this ribbed section of the leg. And I actually kind of want these all lined up. And so this is the, Sim 4D does have like align tools. I don't know, I'm just not in the habit of using them because I usually do this. I just go to T for scale and hold down Shift. And that's going to align all the points I've selected. Right? Essentially, you're turning the scale in between them to 0. So you smush them all on one axis. So that aligns all of those points. And then this aligns all of these points. Right? Because remember, Shift is going to snap it to 5% increments. And so it makes it really easy to just easily and very quickly dial it down to 0. And now all of these points are aligned and all of those points are aligned. And so now I can grab all of these points and chamfer. It's something very smooth. And maybe the same thing at this point, this point, this point. There we go. So that's pretty good. These points up here, I want this flat at the top. And so I'm going to grab both of these and hit T and scale them, hold down Shift, down to 0. Now the top is perfectly flat. And so when I turn this back on, let's take a look at it. Cool. Geometry is a little dense right there. How do I lighten this up? That's exactly right. So if I turn this up a little bit, can chill some of that out. Still plenty of polygons for it to be nice and curved. Looks good. All right, so I got fancy woodworker's table leg kind of thing. Make sense? So that's your lathe. So you see how using these 2D splines to either extrude or sweep or spin, we can make a bunch of different shapes this way. Everybody with me there? This is a table leg. And let's turn these on and move them. And I'm going to group these together, just sort of Alt-G, and call this lathe. And one more here. So I don't use, those are the 95% of the shapes I create with those 3 tools, right? We're either extruding a spline and going from there, sweeping a spline and going from there, or lathing a spline, going from there. Occasionally, we need one more here, and that one is this one, the Loft Tool. Again, if you look at it, it tells you kind of exactly how this works. It's kind of like a connect the dots, but more of like a connect the lines between splines. And so this, there's a lot of different options for kind of shapes you can make here with this thing. But for instance, I am going to so the way the loft, if I make a shape here, I'm going to, usually this, if I use the sketch, I usually turn the smoothing way up so that the number of points I'm getting is much, much lower. In general, much better to have a lesser amount of points rather than a larger amount of points. Let's give this a little bit more. Also, when you're drawing splines, watch this part. So if I draw a spline and then draw another spline and draw another spline, they are all in this object. Okay, so this is kind of like how Adobe works. Certainly in Illustrator, After Effects works this way. If I keep the spline selected while I'm drawing, it puts them all into one object. Okay, and so this is okay in some instances. We'll use it coming up, but in this case, not that great. And so I'm going to go back to this tool and say, create a new spline each time. There we go. So I've got a bunch of splines. And I'm going to just sort of displace them here. I'm going to go back to object mode and just sort of move them up. There we go. And so I'm defining a shape here, and if I dump this in a loft, like so, you see it connects the splines to form a 3D piece of geometry. And it's still live, so I can move these to change the geometry. Now the thing that you can get in trouble with here is if you copy drag some of it, the order matters. And so if you see now it's kind of like doubling back on itself. And so if I were to copy drag something, I would need to go back and sort it out so that it's in the right order, so that it's correct. So I this one over. Since we got the rocket launch today, let's make kind of a stylized rocket. And so I'll get the star. I'm going to make this from the top. And so I'm going to put the star in there, kind of like so, on the floor. Maybe give it more like that. And then I'll grab a circle, move that one up, hit T, bring it down a little bit, get another circle. I'm going to go ahead and command drag this one up, E, up here, hit T, bring that one out, and then grab a square, from the top. If I make them in the top view, they'll be directly on the floor. Gotta make sure the top view is selected. There we go. Bring this one down. And then maybe I'll duplicate that to make it very thin. Okay. And so I've got this. This star is going to need to be bigger. And I'll go ahead and put this inside a loft. All of it. And here we go. Now with the loft can be a little bit more difficult to wrangle the polygons. There's two levels of subdivision, sort of the radial, which if you dial down too low, you kind of lose some of the resolution of what's happening. Like you don't have enough to actually get all the shapes, so it needs to be a little bit higher. And then the subdivision's in the other direction, which we can keep kind of low. And then there's this twisting, and so often you need to come in and sort of wrangle some of this, just twisting the splines. To straighten that out. And so kind of like a stylized rocket. But you can see this like fading or morphing in between the spline shapes. This would be, you guys know enough now, like if I just showed you this shape without showing you this tool, this wouldn't be like an easy shape to just sort of rough out. As far as the idea that the surface features are changing over the course of the shape like this would be much more complicated. And so we'll call that rocket. And this is a sail or something. Making sense here. So using 2D splines to make 3D shapes. So all of these right here, these were done with which shape? All of these guys. And all of these guys here, the next ones. Sweep. And the next one. These are all lathe. And the last one, these are all loft. Make sense? I'll post this example file for everybody as a reference to go back to and see here. There we go. But those are sort of the highlights of those kind of, you can get a lot done. Right? Now, usually these are not the end, right? We get as close as you can using these techniques, and then you start editing the actual geometry, right? After you press C, just like you would on a primitive, to edit it. Cool. Let's practice this a little bit. I can't think of one, so you think of one. Try to think of one object, or maybe two objects, that you can make within 15 minutes that includes at least one of each. So you got to have, it's a, some sort of more multi-part object. You got to use one extrude, one lathe, one loft, one sweep. Ready? Go. I think I have a timer here. Let's do that. I do this? No. Okay, you two chat. Model one object that has all four techniques in 15 minutes. Post screenshot on Slack. Is there space on here? Like there's no space at all on the computer? Go to your files.
Really weird. Like, I recently got a new computer, so I can work on it.
Is this it?
If I did do the file on here, yeah.
No, is this the new computer?
Oh, no. It's a PC, it's definitely.
Oh, okay, good. So go to this PC. Okay. So that's this, right? Yeah, so if you could free up some of that space, that would be best. But yeah, try just force click C for the What are you making?
Just watching you use the Spline Pen.
It's like this whole bottle.
I'm like, is this wrong somehow?
Well, what kind of shape do you want to make out of it?
And the lamp never stands up straight, so I have to kind of like get like something like that.
Is that round or is it?
Yeah, it's like round on top. I didn't change the yet.
So, yeah, you have to put it inside, make it a child of the lathe in order to. I'll look at what kind of shape is that.
Yeah, it's not really.
That's not the kind of shape you want to make? You
No.
want something with radial symmetry?
It's supposed to have like two little legs.
So, yeah, take it out of the lathe, put it in extrude.
Spline.
So yeah, see how you always want to have these ones so you can see what's there too. So yeah, when you extrude stuff, if it doesn't extrude it away from the spline, it's all mushed together. So select the extrude. Go to object. And see like a direction there. That's where you change. Try X. Nope. Try Y.
But it's not filled in.
So if you want to fill it in, you don't need to draw the inside wall.
Oh.
Right, so that draw the inside and draw the outside, that's for objects that have an inside, right? Like you want to
Oh,
have.
that's like just for making like holes and stuff?
Right, yeah, yeah. Right, if you're not gonna, if it's not an object that doesn't open up, you don't need to draw the inside.
So, like, if I was, okay, so extrude would be for any shape that's like if you're making a person's head.
Yeah, most of the things
Like
you're gonna make,
square.
you're just gonna make the outside. Yeah, you got the right idea. You got the helix, but you wouldn't want to extrude. You want to sweep. So probably a very thin rectangle that you sweep along the helix. What did you recommend for the top? Oh, okay. So it's like a trim on the edge. Okay. Okay. Everybody saving? I am out. No, you can upload it when you're ready. Everybody's still working here a little bit. So Emily, 740 works better on your other computer? Okay.
electronics for unclear and by clear concept for the ground segment engineer.
Say that again?
Yeah, there you go.
Creating a ground segment counter.
In the helix, there's total rotation.
One second. Stand by for object.
Creating a launch control on type of launch object. Launch control, loud and clear, stand by for concept.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
Dragon, chief engineer, countdown one, check.
Yeah, so that might take a while. I'll put it in the middle.
Be loud and clear, have a great flight. This completes our com check.
Just inside T-minus 1 hour and 43 minutes. We've heard com checks between the Inspiration 4 crew up in the Dragon capsule, up at the very top of the picture to the left, behind the crew access on this. That's where Dragon is with the crew right now. They're talking to the Falcon 9 launch team located in Fire Room 4, just a few miles just west of the launch pad. Have a great view out the windows. Earlier we saw a picture of the crew signing their names on the booster that has gone to space a couple of times, and that's an example of reusability of the Falcon 9. We've talked reusability several times in the webcast. Our boss, Elon Musk, he's made it clear for years and years, the holy grail of space travel, what opens up space for humanity to become a spacefaring civilization, is reusability. Without it, spaceflight is just not affordable. And I think as we mentioned earlier, if you threw the airplane away after every flight, no one would be flying anymore. So each step in SpaceX's history has been focusing on incorporating reusability step by step into our designs. First with Falcon 1, people may not remember, we did want to try to get the Falcon 1 first stages back so that we could look at them, not fly them again. We rolled that in.
Very nice, Belle. Can you tell us which parts are which?
And then the little rods there are actually just cylinders, I could make it a sweep, but
Yeah. And so the shade is a loft?
the shade is a lot.
Awesome. Marvin said, "Here's a donut I promised you. We can split it." Who shares a donut? No one does that. Everybody hitting save? Cool. All right, let's keep going. Let's keep going. You guys are getting the gist. For Monday, I have a series on LinkedIn Learning for you to watch with Andy Needham. He's great, going over parametric objects in Cinema 4D. And let's get through that menu real quick here. So here's what I put together. Again, space, I guess, today. Like the rocket with the lathe or a loft and some, tubes and piping. That's always going to be sweep stuff. I cheated on the scaffolding. Let's talk about that. Okay, we covered all of these objects right here. And these are the ones we were just talking about, right? They take the generators that take splines as input to output 3D stuff. Everybody with me? Okay. Let's look over here. And so all of the stuff in this menu is kind of other stuff. I don't know, other generators that aren't necessarily spline based, and they aren't part of the MoGraph. And so let's look at this list of stuff. We have the subdivision surface. What are the most important ones here? Subdivision surface, symmetry, polygon reduction, the connect, the atom array, the instance, the bool, and maybe we'll get to Remesh. So these all do certain things to geometry. We talked a little bit about subdivision surface before, right? We used it with the donut on Monday, right? And so somebody explain to me what this subdivision surface does. Not Bell. Why would you want to subdivide a surface? In order to smooth it, add curves, right? And so I think the simplest explanation of this is putting a cube inside a subdivision surface. Gives me a sphere, right? And so it's essentially rounded in between each of the edges on the cube. And I said this a little bit before. This is one of those ones where we get different values for the editor and the renderer. And when you're dialing these up, do not grab this with your mouse and drag, because even just a little bit of change here can cause exponentially more polygons, and the whole thing hangs or gets just caught up and doesn't do anything. So the subdivision surface. We've done this a little bit with the donut, but once you hit C on an object inside the subdivision surface, you're essentially doing subdivision surface modeling. And so now all of our tools like inner extrude and extrude, we can sort of see them play out in real time. And you can see how this would work, right? Creating like a cup kind of thing here. And just the basic subdivision surface modeling, we're able to get this this smoothing is happening with the object, right? And so another way to create a, like a cup kind of thing here would be to use this and then add more edges or cuts to sharpen up the geometry, right? So this is very, very rounded right now. I'm going to go to KL for loop cut, and watch how I can use the loop cuts to add more definition to this, right? So I'll add one right here. That sharpens up that edge. I'll add one right here, right? So that's much, much sharper. If I cut the whole way around the bottom, now I have something like that, right? So this is a powerful way to make smooth things that aren't necessarily too mechanistic, but you can manipulate the shape in real time. You see, if I cut over here on this side, now we've sort of flattened out that side. Why? Because we're decreasing the distance between edges. When the distance between the edges is greater, there'll be more smoothing. When the distance between the edges is shorter, there'll be less smoothing, right? Another good example of doing something with this one might be let's put a cylinder in there and make like a barbell, or a dumbbell rather. What's the smaller one? It's dumbbell, isn't it? Let's say this way. And I'm going to use way less rotation segments. Let's just say 6. There we go. And I'm going to put this inside the subdivision surface. So far, so good. And now I'm going to go ahead and grab the end. Hit C on the cylinder and grab the end here. So UL. And let's hit I. I'll extrude this out. Okay, so now this is something I probably want both sides to match. And in this case, where you have something that's perfectly symmetrical, you can select both sides at the same time and then kind of manipulate both sides simultaneously. So there's an inner extrude. D, there's an extrude. And here's another inner extrude. Right, so by combining those two things, here's what it looks like without the sub D surface. Here it is with the surface, right? And so if I wanted to sharpen up the handle, I could make a loop cut very close, right? So if I want to sharpen up, this is pretty rounded right there. If I wanted to sharpen that up, I'll make a cut there. And you see that that sharpens up that edge there. And I wanted these to be more defined. I'll make a cut here and here, and then here and here. Make sense? There's a lot more to be said about subdivision surface modeling, but this is the basic idea. We're using the super low poly, and then usually using loop cuts in order to define more closely defined rounded edges, right? So would you use a bevel on something like this? No, right? Because those are sort of two options for rounding. Either you go the bevel route, which would be more of like a hard surface technique, or you go the subdivision surface route. You don't usually use both together. Make sense? Okay, we've kind of used that one before. Let's keep going. We've got let's move this one out of the way. The symmetry object, which does a lot of what you think it does. So I'm going to take the sphere, and I'm going to take the sphere and move it underneath the symmetry, and then move the sphere. And the symmetry object obviously makes something symmetrical, right? So right now, it's set to do it along a specific plane. It mirrors one side to the other side. But you need to pick which plane it's going to be mirroring the different things to. And so you see, this is only one sphere. But if I did things to this sphere here, they'd be mirrored on the other side. I think we need to group them together. There we go. So now anything that's together underneath that group would be mirrored on the other side. So this is good. Let's look at another more important part. So if I go to we'll take a cube and we'll move this over. I'm going to make it a child of the symmetry. And hit that. And I want it to be the same on this side and this side.
What if you just in the symmetry, are you trying to get to mirror the other way?
No, this way is fine. We'll be, well, I guess if we're going to do forward Z, we want Z to be forward. So we'll do this way.
So
It's
in the
good.
symmetry object, you can just change the mirror plane.
Yeah, we have the plane there. So I'm going to go ahead and delete one of these faces here. Because a lot of times when you end up using this, you're using it to model one half of the object to make sure the other half of the object is exactly the same. So for instance here, I'm going to go ahead and take this cube and hit C on it, get rid of this polygon. There we go, those are both the same now. And then let's move all of this back here, kind of like so. Maybe smush this a little bit, do some kind of spaceship thing. So I'm going to grab this part over here and hit D, and then T, and bring this down, E, move this back a little bit, there we go, and grab this one, and hit D, extrude this out, and then maybe T, you see how this is working? Yeah? The thing that becomes an issue here in the symmetry is that we eventually want this to become one piece of geometry. And let's turn it off for a second and look. The first thing is that you want to make sure that the inner side there's no internal polygons. And so let's get rid of this one, and let's get rid of this one. Okay, so far so good. Now, if I were to turn this back on, that looks pretty good. Let's add a fin or something to it, maybe by adding 2 cuts, and then come over here and extrude this, T, E, T, gonna do that kind of thing. Add another cut here, and here perhaps. And then move these up a bit. Okay, so let's check our rules again. Let's look at this. Okay, by extruding, that gave me a little bit of internal geometry there. Again, I don't want that, so just delete those polygons again. That's good. So now, a common workflow is that, again, you're using this to duplicate everything, and then it's a spaceship, right? So I want it to be all smooth, right? It's one of those smooth space movies, not one of those blocky space movies. And so I need to put it inside which object that we just used. Exactly. Let's put it inside there. And if we look at what we got, this looks okay, but now there should be some red flags going off in your mind, right? When you're starting to see, okay, there's some like weird tearing there. And then up here, it seems like all this should be just one edge here in the center, right? So there's some bad geometry that should be flashing in your mind here. In the symmetry object, there is a weld points. And so this will procedurally take points that are within a certain distance and fuse them together. And so this distance is pretty small by default, 0.01. Let's see if I can fix this just by turning that up. And so again, this is a parameter. I don't know what range I want, really. So what was the advice I gave you guys before about parameters with ranges? Was that this class or a different class? It may have been a different class. If I don't know, I usually go by orders of magnitude. Rather than from going from 0.1 to 0.2, I'll go 0.01 to 0.1. And let's see if that fuses anything together. Nope. Let's say 0.8. There we go. So we can see some of this stuff is getting fused together here. Let's say 1. And let's say 5. There we go. And so now, right, does everyone feel much better, right? Now that you're looking at like clean geometry, right? Before, there's like, oh man, there's a lot of problems there. But now, your soul should feel more at ease. Kyler? Okay, don't get too at ease. You don't want to fall asleep. But you feel more relaxed? Okay. But this is a workflow for a lot of things. Spaceships, fish, whales, those types of smooth organic shapes where they have symmetry, right? Why model both sides of the shark when you can just make half the shark, and that way the other half of the shark will be exactly the same. Birds, maybe not birds so much, but definitely fish, that kind of thing. Does that make sense for everybody? But this is one of the things that really comes into an issue here as far as smoothing things, putting things together here, right? So the symmetry object, really great as long as you understand which plane you're on and about welding points. So the weld we want on, let's look at the other way to fix this that you should know about. So it's all of these points here that are in the middle that would be the problem. So I'm going to come into edge mode and go to UL, which is loop select, and select that. And so the problem is that all of these points are not on the same plane. This is a really important term to memorize. If they were on the same plane, they would be coplanar. That's what that means. All of the points within some polygon exist on one plane. All the points on one polygon exist within one plane. The easy way to conceptualize this is that all triangles are coplanar, right? Any 3 points in space, once you connect them, exist on the same plane. Once you add a 4th point, then we get into a situation where things can be coplanar or not coplanar. We'll call them quads like we should, quads and above. So what's above a quad? What's more than 4 points? Right, quads and n-gons. But any triangle would be coplanar by default, just by the way 3 points work in space. Does this make sense for everybody? Okay, so the other way, this is essentially what we need to do with these points is make them coplanar. How can we tell they're not? Well, our symmetry object didn't work. That was a giveaway. But then down here, we have this again. So before we were getting the position of 1 point for the lathe object, and we moved it to exactly 0 when we used this before. The other thing, when you select multiple objects, this is sort of like the size of the bounding box, right? How big is the scale of the box that contains all of the selected points? And you see that we do have some amount of size in the x direction, which is where we want to flatten them so that they all are coplanar. And so there I can just select this and press 0. And now it's flattened all of them so that they are coplanar, perfectly flat. And if I were to turn things back on, now it looks pretty good, even though the welding is not as high as it was before. Right? So this would be my preferred piece of advice here, is to make all of the faces here where you're going to be symmetrical coplanar, and then adjust this as needed. Okay? Don't lean on this, because it's going to give you problems. Especially if there's way more polygons in your object, then you're going to have some issues here. The symmetry object. Sound good? Awesome. Let's keep going. So we got symmetry, subdivision surface, the connect object. This one is a big one. You're starting to get how Cinema 4D works. We're building these hierarchies of objects. They all relate to each other. The connect object fixes hierarchies. Usually, if something is not working the way you want it to, it's because the objects aren't sort of connected together. And so the connect object helps us quite a bit. It's essentially doing what the symmetry object did there, but it's welding objects together within a certain tolerance again. So, for instance, let's look at one instance of this. I'm going to take here, I've got an idea for this one. Let's come back to this in a second because we need to learn one more thing first. So we have our connect for fusing things together. The next most important one that I'm going to teach you with reservation is the bool. All right, so watch what the bool does. Right, Boolean math. Everybody knows what's a Venn diagram. A Venn diagram are those diagrams with circles, where you have a circle and a circle and there's some overlapping part in the middle, and then this is something else, this is a Venn diagram, right? And so this is where something is true, this is where something else is true, and then this is where both things are true. Does that make sense? The Boolean object works in a similar way. So, for instance, we have a sphere, and I'll make another sphere, kind of like so. Make this one smaller, and I'll put them both inside the bool object. And you see it subtracts one object from another object. Now, the order, since it defaults to subtraction, the order matters here. This is okay, right? If you look at upon further inspection, especially in this particular example, this is not a great way to cut holes in objects most of the time. Things can be it can create some pretty bad geometry, right? Because this is the object. As soon as people see this, they're like, oh, okay, this is how I cut holes into things, right? In some instances, it works well in that regard. Because this looks okay, right? But what is going on here that we would want to fix now along this edge? Too sharp. Exactly, right? So we want to round it. What are some rounding strategies we know? No, the magnet tool just pushes stuff around, doesn't necessarily round an edge. Bevel, right? And the subdivision surface that we just talked about, right? Let's try those with this. So subdivision surface seems easy. I know how to use that. I'll just dump my thing into a subdivision surface. Let's see how that goes. All right, but you see it doesn't really round that edge. We've subdivided other things, so that's not that great. Because our geometry doesn't line up. See how this has an edge here, doesn't really connect to this one, doesn't continue it through. All this is not super. The other way is the bevel object. So if we grab the bevel and group these two together here, you can see this does round the edge here, but again, you should be having some alarm bells go off, right? Because look at the resulting geometry here. This all looks not great, not clean. And so in this instance, the bool tool is really not what we're after for doing this type of thing, right? If you had to make a hole like this in a sphere, you know, you'd be much better off sort of, again, making sure that the geometry actually follows the shape. See how the geometry and the shape that we have here are really at odds? If you wanted to make a shape like this that was much cleaner, I would do it by just manipulating the points so that the object, so the flow of the object follows what's going on. And then if I beveled this object, look at that. Does that make you feel better? Right? So the one, okay, great. So never use the bool object? No, you can use the bool object when it results in cleaner geometry. So for instance, usually things that are more squared off. Rounded, subdivided surfaces usually don't play well with the bool object. So for instance, if I start using squares here, or cubes, as the case may be, and bring this one in, that's a T, and control drag another one, bring this up, kind of like so, and T, if I were to subtract these two objects from each other, there we go. Right? And so here, I mean, this would not be a hard object to make with an inner extrude and an extrude, but in this case, it does. Like, say we want something that's going to be easy to adjust later, and we want to make it slightly off-center, something like this. Right? This looks pretty clean because it is pretty clean. And even if we did use the bevel on this, right? So grab both these objects and Alt-G, right? The bevel also seems to be playing well with what, you know, up until a point. That's nice and clean. Right? So these more rounded situations. Now, the thing about the bool, which isn't great, let's say this is, you know, the client's like, okay, that looks good. Can we have another hole in this? So you need to stack the Boolean objects to make that happen. And so now, let me grab another cube, come in here, T, bring this down, there we go, E, move this, kind of like so. And so now I need to create another bool. And I'll subtract this from the other bool, like so. Make sense? Right? So you end up with a lot of this kind of thing, where objects are sort of stacked, subtractions on top of subtractions. But if even it's still fairly clean, and so if we were to put all this back inside here with the null, with the bevel, it still should look okay. Let's see. Let's move this up to here. And this is another one here. Look at this. Okay, so this edge looks pretty good here. This inner edge looks pretty good, nice and rounded. But then I look here, not good, right? No rounding happening. Why not? The bool has one very important box, this one. Whether or not what it does is going to be fused together into one object or not. And so in order for a lot of the purple operators to work correctly, you do want to bring it together. This box should probably be checked by default. Once I check that box, look at that. I get a nice beautiful bevel on the edge there. And now all the way down, I've got bevels, and everything is procedural. So I can easily move this hole around. I could resize this, move this over. I could move both of these as I would need to. You see, this is where the Boolean object shines, right? I've got something that's fairly squared off, fairly geometric, and now it's super easy to edit. We could make the same shape with an inner extrude and an extrude, but it might not be quite as easy to adjust in the same way, right? As far as like this object represents the hole. And so if I want the hole in a different place, I can just move the object. It needs to be deeper. There we go. Make sense? All right, so this is the Boolean object. Okay, but this is not how you cut every hole into a piece of everything else, right? There's certain instances in which this works, mostly squared off things. This is not the solution for cutting a hole into everything. Everybody with me there? So please don't do that. Boolean, cool. Subdivision surface, symmetry. Let's look at the other one. The atom array. This is super fun to turn something into a grid. So here's this. I'll take a cube and put it inside the atom array. And the formula is that it traces each edge and puts a sphere on each vertex. Now you can adjust the sphere size, right? If you needed to make some sort of like more like atomic visualization kind of thing, you could do that there. Usually, I'm just using it to make like a scaffolding, and so I'm just turning up the cylinder radius so that it kind of traces the whole thing. And this is nice because now I can adjust the segments in the cube, and again, it's procedural. Everything updates. Does that make sense? Now, one more object, the instance. So here, the instance object, right? If I have this scaffolding and the client comes back and says, oh, I want 10 scaffoldings. Oh, here we go. This is a good one. Let's move this anchor point over here so that's correct. So how do I make a copy of this thing? Control drag. Good. Gotta let go of the mouse first. The client says I want 5 of them. No problem. All right, thank you. I'll be invoicing you soon. Hold on a second. I want you to make one more change. I want them all to have another rung down the middle. Ugh. Okay, well, let me delete the other 4, go back, and fix this one. And there we go. And now recopy. This is a problem, right? Where we have 1, and we want it to be, we want to duplicate it, but we want to make a smart copy, right? A clone, so that if we update the original, all the clones change, right? Those of you familiar with Unity, this is like a prefab, where if you change the original, everything changes. And so I can do that by, if you have it selected and you just make a new instance right here, that will make a new instance. I'll move this one over. There we go. And so now I'll control drag the instance. And now if I make any changes to the original, they all change. This sells itself, right? Makes sense? Client comes back and says, all right, we talked to our clients, and now they don't, they just want it to be a box. Okay, well, I guess we can just do this, this, and this, and then you're done. Oh, we talked to them again. Now they want one. Okay, yeah, there we go. All right, now I'm going to invoice you. So the instance, super powerful, smart copy, right? As long as you copy the instance. And let's do the we did the atom array. We've done the symmetry. We talked about subdivision surface. We did some Boolean. So the Boolean usually makes a lot of sense for everybody, right? Right, say we wanted to make a jack-o'-lantern.
I still have the CD Boolean tools.
Yeah, I was going to have everybody install those next week. So there's a bunch of other tools in Cinema 4D, like, I don't know why they're not as integrated. I don't know. But anyways, we can download that stuff next week. Just so we know how this stuff works, there's a bunch of other meta tools that allow you to do a few of these things with a couple less clicks. But they do the same things. The Boolean makes a lot of sense, right? We use another shape to define a cutout and something else, right? But like I said, geometrically works really great when it's squared off, but not so much when things are smooth. But that concept makes a lot of sense. Allow me to introduce, it would be great if we had a Boolean for everything, right? We kind of do. So this is a different workflow. The smush stuff together workflow. All right, so let's make a snowman, I guess. Or, no, we'll make a jack-o'-lantern, right? And so here I've got this. I'm going to make it smoother, kind of like so. I'm going to hit C and T, bring this down a little bit, like that. Like a jack-o'-lantern-like thing. No, let's do the snowman first. He's okay. He's okay, don't worry. Okay, on some level this looks kind of like a snowman, but it definitely looks like three distinct things. It's not mushed together like you would expect snow to look like, right? And so this brings us to our menu here. These are all of the volume tools. So watch how this works. This allows you to smush stuff together as long as you get a special formula. So first I'm going to use the volume builder. And so everything that's underneath the volume builder gets smushed together. I'm going to take these and put them in here. And I got this. This has essentially been voxelized, right? What's the popular voxel game? Minecraft, right? Everything is voxelized. It's all tiny, like the whole world made of tiny blocks, right? All those are called voxels. It's like 3D pixelization, kind of. Everything's in there. So everything's been voxelized, but if you look at this, you've got to render it that's not there. This is like the pre-computing stage. The computer's, figuring out, is essentially filling the volume of whatever it is that you've defined here with shapes. And the most important thing here is this is the voxel size. When this number goes down, there's more detail. When it goes up, there is less. So you don't want to go too far down. I might just go down to like 8. And then we get more detail. If you dial it down too far, again, way more computation, computer C4D might crash. So how do I turn this into a mesh? If you look at the list here, you got to put the volume builder in the volume mesher. Not that one. In the volume mesher. I'm going to make the volume mesher, and then I'm going to put the volume builder in the volume mesher, and there we go. Now, you see it's fused everything all together into one volume object. Makes sense, right? And so now, again, even if you wanted to make eyes or something, you can bring this down, up here, depending on how much you wanted them to look like they're part of the same object. Bring this over. And how do I get them into the system? You just simply make them a child, just like the other stuff. And it's still editable. So if I need to adjust, you can see it sort of start to mush together as it gets closer. Now, this is all great, right? Looks totally cool. What if we he needs a hat? What if he had what if he was in a terrible accident?
They have spider legs.
and he lost part of his torso. I'm going to bring this one in here. And if I go to my volume builder, I get a whole list down here. And this one, I'm going to call this one Terrible Accident. And instead of being part of a union, we will subtract. Say the accident was even more terrible. We could dial up the size. Don't do it! What did he ever do to you?
Already looks terrified.
So Boolean for everything else, right? We're able to add and subtract shapes in this whole volume system. The only downside is like, yeah, the resulting mesh here doesn't look all that great, right? What does good mesh look like? Clean loops around the whole thing. What's the best kind of polygon? Quads. Quads are the best, right? Because if you have quads, all your quads, when it gets down to it, the computer only does triangles. It divides, every quad always becomes 2 triangles, right? If you have an n-gon, that's where things get weird. And so the last part of this formula is an object that's back in the other menu, that's new, that is awesome, called Remesh. So Remesh redoes the topology. It's not magic, but it's pretty good. If I put the whole thing inside the Remesh, watch the mesh. See what happened there? Now, I mean, mesh still doesn't look great, but this is way better than what we had before. Why? Why is it better? Because the size of the polygons over the surface of the object is pretty much consistent, right? And with some more work, we could get it down to some better, edge flow. In the Remesh object, there's you can also dial up or down the density to get more or less of the detail. And again, everything is still editable, right? If they come in, they're like, that looked great. I don't know why he was in a terrible accident. You can be like, oh, okay, well, he's fine. You can just get rid of that one object. He needs an arm. Okay. Oh, yeah, you can use splines, right? So he needs an arm. You can come in here with this sketch tool. And, oh, that was from the wrong angle. There we go. Let's say from here. So volume work, there's a lot to do here, right? So let's do 2 things for this Monday. Actually, where's my stuff? So we have our parametric objects. So this is a lot of what we just went over, creating a scene using the parametric objects. Actually, let's just do this one. Casey said, too much to everyone's relief. So follow along with Andy, and he puts together this scene. And now this scene should make a lot of sense to you as far as what's in here. Yes? No, make it different somehow.
So does it have to be exactly the same, or can it?
Well, the follow along with him to be the same, right? And then create 5 new objects of your own, and then take away all of the old objects and just do something with your own objects,
Okay.
right? And so you end up with I think we just did 3, right? So you're going to have okay. The one where you follow along with Andy, then go through and change, scale what you have there to make a new scene. Then bring in 5 of your own things with the old things, and then something with just your stuff. Make sense? And here, I did one of just parametric objects. This is the zip file for that one, if you want to check that one out. Does that make sense for everybody? Cool. There's some good ones last semester. Let me see if it's still up on Slack.
I mean, I think I saw them last semester, or whatever semester I took.
Yeah, I was looking through something again.
Oh, here we go. Right? Evelyn did a really great job with this one. There it is. She moved some things around. This is all of her own objects. And then, make sense? And it goes without saying, try to make all of the images compelling. Don't just move stuff around for the sake of moving them around. Like, have an agenda. You guys are artists. I mean, there's a banana in there, and I feel like people really haven't leveraged that to its creative potential. Allow that, we'll call this the banana challenge.
Can I switch out the banana?
Can you what?
I'd rather use the banana used in FMP than use the banana he provides.
Yeah, sure. You can use your own banana. Okay.
His instructions.
With the banana?
Yeah, when he like shows you how to quickly model the banana and then paint it, it's kind of like, just do this. Like it looks. But like really, really low quality banana photo.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, if you want to improve the banana, go ahead.
Just for Alright, and I have 22
Jose says he thinks that looks like a Mario 63? I think he means Mario 64, Snowman.